Mike, what exactly is competitiveness?
Competitiveness is the productivity with which a nation uses its resources, its labor, its capital, its natural resources. And competitiveness is what sets the fundamental prosperity of a nation. If you can use your resources productively, if you can be productive in a day of work, if you can use your capital productively, you can support a high wage, even a high standard of living. Um, there's a lot of confusion, though, about competitiveness. A lot of people think of competitiveness in its more intuitive definition of market share. Is this country gaining share against another country? That's a very dangerous way to look at it because, of course, competitiveness is not a zero-sum game. All nations can improve their competitiveness if they can improve their productivity. If nations can improve their productivity, and wages and incomes go up, the pool of demand goes up. There are more and more human needs to be met, and those needs can be met more and more productively. So if you can enhance competitiveness in the world economy, it creates really a win-win opportunity for all.
And does discussions of competitiveness mostly focus on the role of macroeconomic policies? Is progress in this area alone sufficient?
Well, clearly, macroeconomic policies are very important, and I think it's well known that we want stable macroeconomic policies. We want low interest rates, low inflation, and so forth. And there's another set of factors like political stability, like a sound legal system. We might call these things kind of broad contextual factors, and I think there's a lot of understanding that those are important. But I think what we've found more and more over the years is that macroeconomics, political, and legal factors really create the environment for prosperity, but they actually don't create prosperity. Prosperity is actually created by the microeconomic capabilities of an economy, the actual capacity and skills of firms to produce valuable goods and services. Only firms can create wealth. A government can't create wealth. Macroeconomic policy can't create wealth. So competitiveness fundamentally is driven by the microeconomic capabilities of the economy. And so this is what we've been trying to understand and measure over these years as we've been pursuing the GCR report.
And what are the central challenges for a nation to improve its productivity?
Well, this is a tough one because what we've learned, of course, is that pretty much everything matters for productivity and competitiveness. The roads matter, the schools matter, the weather matters, all kinds of things matter, and there's a myriad of factors that shape the productive potential of an economy, the efficiency of an economy, the skill level of an economy, and so forth. That says that competitiveness is a challenge because there's no silver bullet. There's no one policy that if you can set that policy, you'll be successful. You've got to make progress on many fronts and keep upgrading productivity over time. In understanding competitiveness, really, there are two big sets of factors that matter. One is actually the capability of firms. The competitiveness of your economy has a lot to do with the competitiveness of the firms that are operating in that economy, both the local firms as well as the subsidiaries of foreign companies that are operating in that economy. If they're productive, if they're efficient, then that is a positive for productivity and for competitiveness. But we've also found that the competitiveness of firms, if you will, is very, very heavily influenced by the quality of the business environment in which those firms are operating. The quality of the skills that firms can hire, the quality of the infrastructure they use, whether the rules of the game for competition are really aligned with investment in productivity. So the challenge of competitiveness for any country, and this is the reason why so few countries really have sustained success in this area, is that you've got to mount a systematic, sustained effort to really upgrade all aspects of your economic platform.
Now, stages of development are probably an important factor. There's probably differences. How, for example, would you compare India with the United States?
When we think about enhancing competitiveness, clearly countries are at very different places along the continuum of really being a early stage, what we call a factor-driven economy that's depending most heavily on its cheap labor and natural resources, all the way to a country like the United States, which is what we would call an innovation-driven economy, which is winning not because it's cheap to do business in the U.S., but because it's very, very innovative. It's very creative. The competitiveness challenges then for a country really will vary depending on where it is in its stages of economic development. So for a country like India, India is doing well. We'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later. But India is still got some very basic challenges. Infrastructure, lack of electric power, reliable supply of power, all kinds of bureaucracy and regulation that's still really holding things back. So for an earlier stage developing country like India, you got to get the basics right: the basic infrastructure, the basic education system, the basic rules of the game. When you get to a country like the United States, you're really worrying about the environment for innovation, the scientific and technical capability, the skill levels of the very, very highly trained people, and so forth. And one of the challenges in setting national economic strategy is really to understand what the constraints are that are holding back your economy at any given point in time. And one of the very important purposes of the Global Competitiveness Report is to provide a benchmarking, a very textured, granular benchmarking, which allows a country to kind of understand where its constraints lie.
That gets us into the Business Competitiveness Index, the BCI. How exactly does that index work, and how has it been revised since it appeared last year?
Well, the Business Competitiveness Index is really focused on trying to measure in as rigorous a way as it can the microeconomic capabilities of an economy, the level of productivity that the economy can sustain, and ultimately the level of wealth that the economy can sustain. Again, this doesn't deny the fact that macroeconomic policies and political stability are important, but what we've found is that actually the prosperity of an economy is dominated by the microeconomic circumstances. And these other things can help or hurt, but ultimately don't determine success. The BCI has been continuously refined over the last 6 or 7 years. What it tries to do is use various sources of data to measure these many dimensions that underlie productivity in an economy. The core of the BCI is a large-scale survey. This year, that survey was administered to 11,000 leaders from around the world, and 121 different countries have been ranked this year in the process, up about 10 from last year's survey. The statistical approaches in this year's BCI are by far the best ever, if I don't say so myself. We have actually gone to a pooled time series cross-sectional modeling framework to provide more rigor and more stability to the coefficients of the model by which we estimate competitiveness. And we've also improved significantly the sampling techniques by standardizing the sample. We found that a small country executive answering a survey gives systematically a different answer than a large company executive, for example. The small company folks tend to be more negative than the large company folks. So we have to adjust for the composition of the kind of firms that are filling out the sample. This year, for the first time, we have done that. But despite the complexity of this topic, and despite the complexity of measuring GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power, which is the variable we use to measure prosperity, ultimately, this BCI is remarkable because that one number explains about 80% of the differences across countries in the level of GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power. So it's giving us a very, very powerful indication of what is really underlying that prosperity. This year, we've also added two very interesting additional analyses. One is we're comparing productivity measured by the BCI to the level of prevailing wages in the country. The question is, are the wages in the country expensive or not? And of course, whether wages are high or low from a competitiveness standpoint really depends on how productive the economy is. And so we're able to do that analysis. That, for example, finds that many of the European countries are not a good value. The competitiveness is not high enough to justify the very, very high wages. We've also done a dynamism score this year where we look at some fundamental most important attributes of competitiveness that each stage of country has to address, measure how well each country is moving, its trajectory, and then we calculate a dynamism score. So we can talk about which countries are really moving, which countries are maybe not moving enough and ultimately falling back. And that's a new addition to this year's report.
Now, since the U.S. is rated #1 again, what are some of the factors that contribute to that? And I assume it's fairly high on the dynamism score as well.
Yes. Well, again, the U.S. is again ranked number one, and the U.S. is really an extraordinary economy. It just is. There's a lot of debate in the U.S. right now about competitiveness, but if you look at our data, it's really hard to see too much cause for deep concern, although certainly some issues. The U.S. is ranked number one, first of all, because it has a very high GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power. One of the things we enjoy in the U.S. is very low cost of living and cost of doing business. So unlike in Europe, where you may get a high income, but you have to pay a lot of it out just to live, or Japan, which is the same thing. So we benefit from a very high level of measured prosperity, which is consistent with our competitiveness. The U.S. really is a compelling environment for productivity in terms of competition. This is very striking. The U.S. really ranks number one on rivalry, intensity of rivalry, quality of antitrust, really decentralization of the economy. So first and foremost, the U.S. is a place that believes in competition, and many other countries don't in varying degrees. Number two, the U.S. does very well in terms of risk capital and the incredible depth and competitiveness of capital markets, measured in many ways: venture capital availability, equity financing ability, even access to loans. The U.S. is extraordinarily strong in the rankings. The U.S. also, and this would be the third leg of the stool, is extraordinarily high on all levels of science, innovation, and technology. And although the U.S. Will never, be the only country in the world that's doing science and publishing articles and issuing patents, the U.S. still retains a very strong position. This is not to say the U.S. doesn't have some issues. We can talk about those later.
Now, U.S. is number one. That stayed the same, but some countries have moved up and some have moved down. Maybe you can mention a few of those.
Well, here there's a very interesting set of forces that this report reveals, and again, with our dynamism index and our value index, we now have a somewhat broader picture of these patterns. Again, the U.S. is very high, ranked number one, despite the fact that the U.S. has very high wages. U.S. wages are viewed as a good value relative to the level of competitiveness. And U.S. dynamism is good. It's not the most dynamic economy that we measured, but it's quite dynamic. And so I think the U.S. is holding and maintaining its position. Western European economies, by and large, are disappointing in this report. They are, in some cases, they're holding their position in terms of the BCI rank, but we see really a negative, very mixed dynamism. So, for example, a country like Finland, that was the star, has actually, although it's still ranked number 3 in the ranking, its dynamism is actually negative. It's and so the challenges in Europe of dealing with labor market issues and all kinds of political instability have been slowing down the trajectory of European economies towards really making themselves more competitive. And so this report does not paint a very attractive picture of Europe. Japan is showing a heartening improvement. Japan now has really restored a lot of its vitality. Last year it was kind of in transition. This year I think the data is very compelling. Japan now is again seen as a good value in terms of wages. It's competitive enough to justify its wages. 5 years ago it was seen as a very overvalued place. So Japan has been a success, and it's been moving up in the rankings. Other countries that have moved up in the rankings are Hong Kong has seen a tremendous resurgence. And of the developing countries, India is the star. India has moved up dramatically in the rankings and has actually registered the highest level of dynamism of any economy in the world, the way we measure it. So, and Pakistan is actually not far behind on dynamism. Pakistan sometimes gets lost in the shadow of India, but we see the Pakistanis making some enormous strides. What is perhaps would be interesting to the observers would be that while India is steaming ahead and showing lots of signs of progress, China is actually going backwards. China has lost significant ranks in the report. It has negative dynamism. And so although China represents continually a very compelling place because of very low wages, because of a giant economy, the fundamentals in China don't look like they're making the kind of progress they need to make. And I think the bloom is, the threat here is the bloom goes off the China rose as people understand really how difficult it is to do business in China. We see all the usual concerns, corruption, poor infrastructure, things like that bubbling up in China. Russia is also moving backwards. Russia has enjoyed tremendous economic growth because of very high oil prices and other resource prices, but the fundamentals again in Russia do not look good. In fact, Russia's rank is falling; its dynamism is questionable, and Brazil is pretty much stalled as well. Brazil is hanging in there on BCI rank, but its dynamism again is not measured as very high. So we see here among the large developing economies, we see really a real difference between India and the other major economies, which is really quite interesting. And I think it wouldn't have been the case if we'd have been taking this snapshot 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. So those would be some of the patterns among the countries in this report.
Globalization, a topic of interest to everybody. How has globalization increased the need for a national economic strategy?
Well, what's happened with globalization is that it's meant that countries don't get any guarantee of work just because they're there. You know what I mean? So, and then let's think in terms of an average American. In America, you used to get a lot of benefit just by being an American. You happened to be here, you know, you had a sort of a big advantage on getting lots of kinds of work that was going to take place. In the global economy, though, citizens from all countries, you know, have to really compete on productivity. If you can't provide a productive business platform that justifies or more than justifies your wages, all of a sudden work moves to another location. That is really the central dynamic of the modern global economy. What that means is that is a challenge in the sense that it means that countries have to keep moving and enhancing their productivity, their potential as a business platform. But it also, as I said earlier, creates an opportunity because there's a huge market out there. And the market is expanding dramatically in India and China. There's more and more needs to be met. There's more and more markets to be served. And so companies based in any location can grow substantially if they can tap into this global economy. In general, I think the U.S. has been the country that's been the most flexible and the most dynamic in adapting to this global economy, although that's creating some stresses and strains in the U.S. because as we've moved more aggressively in outsourcing and restructuring and things like that, the American citizen is feeling a bit insecure. And the stakes of raising our skill levels, our education levels is higher and higher in the U.S. Now, what this global world says is that everybody's out there now scrambling around to try to implement best practice in terms of all these economic policies. And what we found is that just trying to kind of pursue best practice is no longer enough. The countries that are really succeeding are the countries that are developing some kind of a unique economic strategy, a unique economic value proposition in a certain set of fields where they can create some sort of extraordinary levels of success. So you think of Ireland. You know, Ireland had a very clear positioning. It was going to be the location for certain kinds of clusters for entering the European market. You know, Singapore's had a very clear strategy around providing this unmatched logistics and infrastructure for certain kinds of companies. It's easier for small countries to have an economic strategy. What that means is that for large companies to be successful, you've got to break the large company into small companies. Countries, which means that you need to get each region specializing. And so the success of China and India doesn't come from the whole country in a sense, it comes from individual regions and states that are developing an economic footprint, a unique value proposition. So I think that what political leaders have to do today is they have to go beyond just kind of copying all the economic policies that every other country is following. They've got to try to put their own unique signature in place for their country as a business location.
So what would your advice be for the U.S.? Although it's number one, what would its strategy be beyond what it's already doing?
Well, I think the U.S. has defined itself really as the preeminent environment for entrepreneurship and science and innovation in the world, and I think the U.S. in some sense then has to realize that strategy by keeping up in all the dimensions that are necessary for doing that. The greatest threat to the U.S. is not the kind of strategic position or the strategic focus of the U.S., which is compelling. I think the threat to the U.S. is really fundamentally in two areas. Number one, we have to have the best educated people if this is going to work. And we are doing very, very well but in certain parts of the population, but we have to maintain our very high college graduation rates. We have to ramp up the quality of our education system, and it's really urgent now because the data shows that people's income, success, and prosperity is very heavily determined by their level of skill and education. So that's one challenge. The U.S., I think, is awakened to that challenge. Everybody's trying. We've got a tremendous number of efforts underway, but we're, traction is hard to achieve. It's a long process. Second big challenge is the U.S. has 3 or 4 what I would call unnecessarily high cost of doing business. One of them is healthcare. One of them is energy. Another one is kind of the pension system, and then finally litigation. All of those areas are areas where we are spending a lot of money in the U.S., but it's not clear we're getting value for it because the systems are not appropriately structured, because the legal environment is not appropriately fluid, and we also find that U.S. is just wasting a lot of energy. Our energy efficiency is low, so you can't afford in an economy to be energy inefficient anymore. It just sops down the cost of it reduces profits, raises the cost of doing business. We've got to change some of those things, and we've got to change them hopefully as quickly as we can.